My name is Jim Lavin. I'm the CTO of a local company here called OrderTalk. I'm a developer who's got about 30 years experience. We do online ordering for restaurants across the world. We've got 50 locations, or 50 chains. We do large chains like Jimmy John's, Jason's Deli. We do Pizza Express in the UK and that. One of the things is we're originally a ASP.NET shop, and part of our application's about 4 or 5 years old, and part of actually bringing it up and getting it updated with new technologies is we were looking at doing really a JavaScript client-side system, and we started out, and I originally rewrote the application using jQuery on the client side, and it took me about 6 months to just do our core ordering piece. And then about a year ago, we actually decided that jQuery, there's just too much code there, and so we were looking at some of the different libraries like Backbone and Ember and Knockout. Since Knockout was being pushed by Microsoft, and us being a Microsoft shop, we actually spent 3 months to take and rewrote what we did in jQuery into Knockout.js. And as we were doing that, and we brought on a couple of new developers, and we were kind of walking them through it, I kind of realized that 3/4 of the code that we were writing in Knockout were basically to wrap stuff so that we could do data binding and handle calls back and forth. So everything that went over the wire, we convert it into a Knockout object, and then we could then use it in the Knockout system. So we had a lot of plumbing code that I thought was kind of unnecessary. So anyway, I tried to find something that was a little bit better, and I saw Angular, and so I started looking at that. And one of the things that's nice about Angular is there is no plumbing code. So a lot of what you do in some of the other frameworks in order to do data binding and to deal with your model view controllers and stuff like that, or you don't have to do it with Angular. It's more of a framework than it is a library. There's pieces in there for, as a matter of fact, that'll get me to my first slide. It's a framework for web applications. And so it actually has stuff to deal with routing for you in between views. It has a full model view controller framework, as well as a dependency injection for everybody that's really big on testability and simplifying your code. So first off, I probably should stop back and say, how many people are writing JavaScript code today? Okay. And how many people are doing jQuery? How many are really good at jQuery selectors? Because I mean, Angular, what they did is they also, in order to make the transition easy from like jQuery and that, they actually include a small library called jQuery Lite, so that a lot of what you deal with is very jQuery-esque from that perspective when you're dealing with elements and stuff. But they also they took back and the creators, what they did was they said, okay, we want to take a whole view of this and we want to kind of break it down. We have data, we have a user interface, and then we have programming logic. And instead of trying to do this all imperatively, which is what we normally do with jQuery and that, they wanted to try to do as much of it as possible declaratively. So they actually came up with directives, which is how the entire Angular framework is actually implemented, is through directives. And I'll kind of talk about that. They're used for data binding. They're used for creating HTML extensions or like web components. So you can create a tabbed component.
Hey, Jim, one second.
Yeah.
How many of you did not get the pizza? Did everybody get the pizza? Just want to make sure.
If we can order some.
We can order some more. Just want to make sure. Hey, you get only 3?
We just didn't get enough this time, but we'll be more than happy to order some more.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's all right. When you're doing that, I'll plug in.
If anybody is there who is interested, because we want to make sure we can order the pizza that you like instead of ordering something.
That's what we're here for.
I'm sure people would go for seconds if you ordered.
Okay, yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Just raise your hands.
Yeah, raise your hands and order some pizza. So we're going to get some 5 boxes.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Which one do you want?
Pepperoni.
Pepperoni.
Can't go wrong with that.
Pepperoni.
Same.
Okay. Looks like you can get some 4 blocks of pepperoni. Do that.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
You want cheese? Okay.
Hey, thanks. Jim.
Oh, no problem. So you know, if you think about your application, you've got your user interface, which is what the customer sees or whoever's on the end of the browser. You've got the data that you're sending back and forth to your server, and you've got your logic to handle your button clicks or to repeat your data if you're doing like a detail, list of detail type of stuff. So what they did is they kind of stepped back and said, okay, how are we going to kind of structure this? And so what they did is they went for the model view controller. But sometimes you'll hear them say it's model view whatever, because you can actually display dynamic data in the HTML without having a controller behind it. Because they do set up like what they call a root scope, which is like a parent of everything. But the way the communication between the model and the view and controller works is, you know, you've got your model, which is going to be plain JavaScript objects. So anything that you get over JSON, you can actually use in your controllers and data bind directly, either one way or two way. So if you data bind with an input field, it will automatically update that object as well. So then you can actually turn around and put it right back on the wire if you need to. So as your model changes, it actually Angular will then notify your UI or your view, which usually the directives saying that something's changed, and then your directives can actually then go and repaint the screen automatically for you. And as things happen on the screen, like you do clicks and that, then that will actually kick off events. That will actually then notify your controller, and you actually use a method called ngClick or onChange, which can call methods in your controller. So we'll get into this a little bit more detail as we go down here. And then as your controller can then change the model, which then in turn kicks the cycle off again, and it'll automatically redraw. Now, behind the scenes, they actually have a set of watchers or scope watchers that will go through and actually monitor the data model. And as it changes, it will kick off these events. And the other thing is, you know, your controllers usually interact with services. So if you're going to need to store data off that you're going to use between multiple controllers, or you need to make calls to and from a back-end service, then basically you put all that logic and that into a service, which you can actually have a singleton that is used by your entire application, or you can instantiate a service over and over like you would a regular object. They have They have a factory pattern and a provider pattern, as well as a service pattern for you. And through this, your model is going to, like I said, it's going to be plain JavaScript objects. Your view is actually going to be the DOM, what's being displayed to the user. Your controller will be JavaScript classes. And then service are just basically JavaScript classes that you're going to kick back, or JavaScript objects with methods. So this is a very simple fragment. What we have up here in the top, at first you have an ng-app, and that is actually the way that Angular bootstraps itself. There's no main function or anything like that to get called. Basically what happens is when Angular comes up, it will look for that ng-app, and you can actually associate that with an application module, and it will load that module, and then everything from that will come from that namespace for you. Then you see we have our script line for Angular and a controller.js file here, which is a very simple controller. And then in the body line, what we do is we can take a segment of HTML and say everything in this HTML is actually controlled by a controller. So you can have multiple controllers in a page, and you'll see some of that when I get into some of the code details later on. But you can actually have multiple different views running at once. I think our application, we have 5 views on the screen at one time. Usually like a header and a footer, and then we have a sidebar for like the ordering part, and then our main content area. And all that changes dynamically as you're going through. And then down in the bottom is our controller, and it's a very simple controller. In this case here, the $scope is actually fed into the controller when it instantiates it. And that is actually created, it's basically created new when they instantiate the controller. And what they do is when they actually create a new view and then they switch views, they'll actually destroy it and then recreate it and give you new stuff that way. But what we do is anything that's actually assigned to that scope will then actually be bindable and actually be usable by the HTML. So in this case here, where you see the little double mustaches with user.name, it's actually going to take and automatically bind that, do a one-way binding, and actually display the value of Larry for you on your screen. And this is the simplest Angular application that you can actually get. And this is actually using the root scope. Just like you have a root DOM object, Angular creates a root scope object, and you can actually init something, use an ng init there, and that will actually create an object in the root scope called user, and then assign Larry to a value of name. And then you can actually take and bind that way off the root scope. You notice there's no controller here or anything. He's just basically working straight with the basic root scope. So it can be very simple and get very complex. In this case here, this is another example, but now what we're doing is we're showing two-way data binding here with the ng model, and that's actually what you use for your data binding for 2 ways. And what that'll do is whenever you type into the input, it will actually update that model object, and in this case the name property on user. And then the ng show, well, this will do is it'll say if user.name is a valid or a truthy value, then show this div, otherwise hide it. And then again, the double mustaches for user.name will display the name. So this is the declarative part of Angular. If you notice, we're not doing a whole bunch of stuff where we're taking and we're grabbing an element and then setting the inner text or the inner HTML or anything like that. We're just basically putting it in line with our HTML. Now, a lot of people have said, well, ng dash is not a valid HTML tag, but Angular actually has made concessions for that, and you can prefix this with data dash or x dash, or you can use ng colon. And a lot of people, do that. They'll actually, so that everything will go through your HTML validators will put data dash in front of everything. So then you have fully compliant HTML syntax. Now the only culprit is IE. IE 9 and before, because they're actually, when we get a little bit more in depth, IE does not like to have elements that is not part of the actual specification for the HTML or W3 spec. They actually use an XML schema to validate it. And so what you have to do is you actually have to declare stuff ahead of time. And they've got a big long dissertation out on the Angular site that will they'll kind of walk you through what to do. So if you're going to use Angular directives as an HTML element instead of an attribute as we're showing here, then there's special things that you need to do in order to be, to work well with the IE 8 and above. Now this is a little bit more detailed controller, and this actually is kind of a full-blown controller. So this is actually associated with the namespace application.controllers, and when you define an Angular module, it actually has methods like .controller, .factory, .directive, .filter. And then what this does is this actually defines a controller that to Angular. So the first thing you see in there is the name of the controller. In this case, it's adjunct list controller. So if anybody's a brewer, they've probably heard of brewing adjuncts. That's rice and corn and crap like that makes beer bad. But then after that, you pass on an array of your dependencies. And the last item in that array is actually going to be your function that defines your controller. So this is actually done for minification purposes. How many people have worked with minification? For anybody that has it, minification, what they do is they go through and everything that's a string, they leave alone. But everything that's not a string, they reduce it to its simplest, like A. So the first function call gets A, and then the next one gets B, and then C, and then they start with A, B, B, and stuff like that. Well, one of the things that Angular does with dependency injection is that it is looking for, an object called scope or a service called location. And if we didn't actually provide these this parameters to the method or to the injector, you wouldn't know how to send in your data. So what they do is they basically pass that in as an array. And then if you notice in the function declaration there on the second line, everything follows in the same sequence. And that way what it does is the Angular objector will say, okay, scope is in the first position, location's in the second, and then the adjunct resource is in the third position. And that's how it knows how to take care of stuff when your code's minified. And then I've just defined a couple of internal data members, adjuncts, grid options. And in this case here, what the grid options is, this is actually for an ng-grid object, which is a plugin. So, and you just provided the options, and then it'll basically give you a nice, very complex grid. And I'll kind of show you that here in a little bit. And then one of the things that I do, that this is not actually part of Angular, but I always create a scope.init function. And that's where I put all my code that I'm going to actually execute to initialize my controller. There's a lot, because it is a function, and it'll just go through and execute everything line after line. You know, some people you'll see they'll just put all their initialization stuff down at the bottom of their controller, and you're not sure, did you mean to execute that, or was that supposed to be in a function or something? So one of the conventions that I always do is I always create this scope.init function. And then what that's doing is it's actually calling a resource to go query a database and bring me back a list of these adjuncts that I was going to display on the screen. And then my last line is actually to execute that init. And a service is pretty similar in the definition, but we're using a factory method off of this module called application.services. And what a factory method is going to do is whenever you call for the localized service, in this case, it's going to create it the very first time, and then it will always give that same object back. So you're getting, it's a singleton pattern that they're using here. And so that way, you only instantiate it once, and then everybody that uses that localized, they're going to basically talk to the same object. And that way, if you're like sharing data between controllers or anything else, you're not sitting there making multiple requests across these services and controllers to get your data. So, and again, you know, we have the right after the name localized, we basically have our array of our dependencies, and then our function declaration for the service. In this case, we're defining this localized object that we're going to return back, and then I'm going out and I'm grabbing. Now, if you notice that Windows got a $sign in front of it, that's because one of the big no-nos in Angular is you do nothing. You never manipulate the DOM, and you never reach out to the browser. You do it through the services that they provide you. The only time you manipulate the DOM is in directives, and that is just basically it's trying to follow rules of responsibility principles. A controller is responsible for managing your data and executing based on the clicks that are coming in, but it's not responsible for manipulating the DOM. And the same with your services. Your services shouldn't manipulate the DOM as you're doing stuff. You leave that for your directives, and then the directives does all the manipulation. So in this case here, we're going out, we're talking to a Windows service, which is actually going to then bump down and get the actual window object, and we get the user language. And then the dictionary is just a definition. We're going to actually go out and get a dictionary of strings, localized resource strings, based on whatever the user's language is. And then we have the success callback, which is going to parse that and handle error messages. And then you'll notice there's like a little root scope.broadcast. This is one of the ways that you can communicate with everybody else in the app environment. That is through a broadcast. And what that'll do is that'll start at the top of the root scope tree, and will send messages down to all the child scopes. You can also emit, which will start wherever you're at in the tree and send it up. So in this case here, we're doing a broadcast that says the localized resources have been updated, and then we're forcing the route to reload itself. That actually caused the window to reload itself. And then the little method in that localized resources here, we're just going through and we're using the HTTP service, which is built into the framework to actually go out, get the dictionary and the data, and then it actually it gives back promises. How many people ever use promises in JavaScript? So what they do is it's a synchronous programming mechanism. So instead of you waiting for the data to come back from the server or for a long compute process to finish, they're going to give you a promise that at a later time they're going to tell you when it's done, and then you can then tie onto that, and you can do like a success function or an error function or a then function and pass in callbacks. And so when that promise is actually fulfilled or rejected, it will either call your success function or your error function for you automatically. And if you've done anything with using a $Ajax jQuery, they kind of have the same thing, success and error. This allows, some of the other things you can do with it is you can go out and make 50 requests and stick all those into an array and say, when all these complete, then I want to move on and do something else. Or you can chain them so that you chain your request one after the other if you need to have synchronous requests. So in this case here, it's just making a call to go get that file, and then based on the language string, and then once he's done, he'll update it. If it fails, he'll go get the default file. So a lot of people say, well, Angular is a templating language or a templating library, and really it is and it isn't. The templates are actually basically HTML plus the directives that you put in there. It's not like you're generating the HTML on the fly. So your directive can be as simple as our little double curly braces on, to actually do one-way binding. Or we can use an ng repeat, which actually what it'll do is it'll take everything that ng repeat on, and it'll repeat it over and over and over for all the items in the collection. So this is the way that you go through and you display a list. And so everything inside that list item is going to be repeated for each item in the list. And then ngView is actually how we actually create a dynamic single-page application and switch it out based on the routing framework. The route provider will automatically change the ngView based on what your URL is in your page. You can also use them for configuration, like we saw earlier with the ng controller. That will basically tell Angular that, okay, I need you to load up this controller and let it take over this part of the DOM. Or with ng model as we do data binding, data binding. And then we can also use like ng show to show or hide. There's actually an ng show and an ng hide. And if it's true, it'll show it. If it's false, it'll hide it for the ng show. Ng hide's the reverse opposite. If you give it a true value, then it will hide the DOM element. If you give it a false value, it'll show it. And so a lot of times you'll see a lot of people's code, they'll have ng show customers logged in, ng hide customers logged in, and depending on whether the customer's logged in or not, then it'll show the options for a logged in user versus the options for a hidden user. And you can also do them as components. As I was talking a little bit earlier, you can actually do these as elements, and so you can extend HTML by creating your own directives. So in this case here, we've got a little rating component, the tabs component. And so in this case here, you've got the tabs, and then inside of it is each a tab, which is basically going to manage. In this case here, they're actually doing a view for each one of the tabs, and then like the tooltip. And a lot of people are writing different ones. There's several different component libraries out there that's pretty heavily used. If you're a Bootstrap user, there's UI Bootstrap that's done by the Angular UI team, which basically wraps all the dynamic stuff for Bootstrap. There's also Kendo UI has a complete set of stuff that now works with it. I'm trying to think. I think it's they're all the leading like jQuery plugin guys that are sell you a component library. They're all working on AngularJS stuff. I think there's at least 4 or 5 out there right now. So if you have a library that you really like if you like Kendo UI from Telerik, you can take that and you can basically plug it into an AngularJS app and get those same components. But there's also a lot of people that are doing their own, like the ng-grid example I'll show you here in a little bit when we get the code demo. They took the slick grid. I don't know if everybody's ever used slick grid, and they rewrote it in Angular to basically work as an Angular component. And so it's a truly dynamic grid that, and when you assign your data to it, you can even do virtualization of your paging and everything. And then directives can also be anything, really. In this case here, this is an example of a directive that is going to basically focus on an element. So in this case here, we've got this mod.directive called focus. And all he's going to do, and directives actually have 3 parts. They have a compile function, they have a pre-length function and a post-length function. And so what happens is once it'll go through, the compile function is responsible for manipulating the DOM and replacing your placeholders with your actual templates that you're going to then do. And then the link function is responsible for going in and tying up your click events, doing any data binding that you might have to do or anything like that. In this case here, this link function, all it's going to do is when it gets called and it executes, it's going to set the focus on whatever element it's attached to. So if you look down here in the bottom, on the user first name, on that first input, that little focus guy there will automatically set the focus on that first input field when everything is done. So I mean, so now you've just extended it. Instead of going out and saying, okay, I want to go find this input equals 0 and then set the focus to it, I can just create a directive for that. I don't have any here, but we also use directives for validation of forms. And that way, like a good example is I've got one that's called must match. And if you're familiar with re-enter your email address or enter your password and confirm your password. So what I have is a directive on there that will actually check the second value and make sure it matches with the first. And otherwise, it'll actually set the entire form as invalid, so you don't submit it. And so there's a whole bunch of those that they have. They follow the HTML5 specs on required, pattern. If you mark something as a number or an email address, it'll even check to make sure that it's a valid email address before it'll make the form valid. And then you can also enable or disable a submit button based on the form name that you give it up at the top of your form. You can say ng disable equals form, whatever your form name is, $, invalid. And so as long as the form's invalid, it will disable your submit button for you. So you don't have to sit there and do a lot of calculations on stuff. Angular was also built with testability in mind, and from the get-go, everything from the dependency injection and a lot of their best practices and a lot of what people talk about is around being able to test everything. And part of that is the ability to do your dependency injection, but they provide you an entire mocking library for all their back-end components. So if you don't want to if you want to do a test of a service that goes out and does queries against a back-end, you can actually mock out your entire back-end. And they have things like HTTP back-end expect, get, and then when that happens, you can actually respond back with data. So you can respond back with fake data. They have a mock timer service. There's several different things. They also they developed Karma. I don't know if anybody ever heard of Testacular or Karma. That was originally developed by the Angular team because JS Test Driver just wasn't doing it for them. And so they wrote their own. And so what it does is they built a Jasmine plugin for it, and it'll go through and it'll run all your Jasmine tests for all your unit tests. And then they also built an Angular scenario runner. They used a very Jasmine-like domains syntax to give you end-to-end tests, so that you can actually say browser.navigate, give it a URL, and then you can say element, and you use a jQuery selector in your element, and you can say .click, or you can say input in the jQuery in the input, you can say .enter and put in text, so you can actually go through and script an end-to-end scenario as well as unit test scenarios. Okay, now I'm going to jump into some demo code. Let me get down here and bring up WebStorm. I will say WebStorm is probably one of the better tools that I've found for doing JavaScript and front-end development. I don't know how many people use it, but it is very good. Get this shrunk down. All right. So this is a little program I wrote called Stogie. So let me get started. Yeah. So it's a cigar rating site. So let me kick up Node here. If you go to rateastogie.com on your phone, it is fully responsive. You can play with it. It's actually running in a reduced mode right now. But, this basically is all the data you're seeing here is dynamic. It's built on Bootstrap, and so I'm using the UI Bootstrap tools to give us the carousel here that's going through, and that's all based off of an array in the background that has the image and the text that it's displaying. This list here is basically a table that's with the rows repeated over it, and if you watch now, if you notice you didn't see it going to hit a database or anything like that. It's all basically flipping everything in. So what it's doing is it took this section here that's from the header where it says rate of stogie down on my footer, and actually just redrew that as part of the ng view. And if I click like on the name of this guy here, he's changed the view again. Now I've got full deep linking. I can actually go back and hit my error. So I don't have to deal with any of the, managing the browser's history stack or anything. I can also go in here and I can type in, let's say, okay, I want to go to, let's see, we'll go here. I'll type in, I think it's log on. All right, let's try register. That'll take me straight to the register page too. So if you were to set a bookmark on something, it'll go straight to you. Go over here and I'll go ahead and I'll log in. Now, this view here where you're going to see me log in, go away last pass. This is going to change out. This is a single view that's actually inside the menu bar header. And right now, since nobody's logged in, it's displaying a login form, right? So let me type in my password and log in, and then what you'll get is I get a new menu called My Stuff, and then it comes back and says Welcome Jim Lavin, and then the little gravatar icon, and then the logout button. So it's one view, but it's got two. If you're logged in, it shows one piece, and you log in and show another. And then with our menu, like my profile, I can see my profile here, and I can update stuff. I can change my password, my email. I can go to my reviews. Get a list of my reviews, and this is that ng grid that I was talking about. So this takes 2 lines of code and an option. And what it does is it will actually take and it automatically formats it for you. Now, the other thing I can do here is I can click on this, and it's got full searching. So if I type in, I'm looking for everything with the word black in it, it'll automatically filter it for me. I can also do sorting based on. I can, in this case here, I can group it by that, or I can actually do sorting. Let's go back over here and let me click on brand here, and let me ungroup it. So if I do it by names, it'll sort it by name, or I can do it by brand, or I can do it by review date. So that's actually all built into it. I didn't have to write any of that code, which is a beautiful thing about it. Now let me show you the code behind that. So that was was one of the rating ones. So we'll start out. So this is my app structure here, and so there's a big debate in the Angular community whether you do stuff based on feature or functionality or layer. So the Angular Seed app, which was the very first Seed app that it came out with, was based on layer. So you put all your controllers in one thing, and all your directives in another directory, and all your services in another. But there's varying opinions out there. And so I basically, my stuff is based on feature, and the whole idea is I could take my localization menu and I could reuse it in another application without having to sit there and redo it. I don't have to go pull 5 different files out and copy them over. I've just got one set of files here, which are all my different localization stuff. Now I do label stuff by function. So my directives, my filters, my services. Let's go over here and I'll show you the what's that? It's users got the login. Yeah. So initially, so when we were looking at the login controller, so this is the login controller here. So at the top, it's really just a div. So we're just taking an HTML template and say, okay, I want to present this, and here's all the content that this one controller is going to manage. So at the top there, you'll see the ng controller. It says login-controller. And then we've got this nice, can everybody see that, or should I make that screen bigger? And you should speak up if you can't see it.
You don't have any room to make it bigger.
Well, I can make the text a little bit bigger. It maybe make it a little bit harder to read. Let's see what my preference is.
What's the NG stand for?
Angular. NG sounds like angle.
Okay. Just check.
No, that's exactly what it stands for. A lot of people were wondering what that meant. So let's make this. So you guys look in the bottom down there, and you tell me when I get it big enough.
It's tested.
Oh.
Tested. Next generation.
I've got to save this first one here. Now, any better, or should we go higher? Is that better? Everybody see that? Okay. We'll leave it that way. Okay, so now you can all see a little bit better?
Yep.
All right. So, again, first thing is like the ng show. So this is where I was telling you a little bit before that where I have like an ng show and an ng hide based on is the user logged in. So what happens is if the user's not logged in, we're going to get this section down here, this bottom here. The ng hide is if the user's logged in, which is basically your two inputs for your username and your password, and then your login button and your register button. And you'll notice I'm using the ng model to talk to an object in the background of the controller called login.username and login.password. And then instead of, so we use ng clicks in Angular to actually handle button clicks or any type of click. If you wanted to have a link and you wanted to click, when they click on it, have a go do function, you use the ng click method. The only thing I will say with links, don't leave an href in there or you'll be chasing, wondering why it keeps going back and recycling the page. We were working with a design firm and they gave us all brand new pages and they defaulted all the links to href path. And I sat there for like a half a day wondering why. Every time I would click on this link, it would go through my method, go to the page I was supposed to go to, and then immediately revert back to the home page. And I was like, what the heck is going on? And then I realized it was because of the href was actually executing afterwards. So in this case, we're going to call a login method, and in this one here, we're going to call the register method, so on the register button. Now, if the user is logged in, which is this top half, then we're going to basically say welcome, whatever your first name is, and then we have a custom and your last name, and then we're going to basically, this gravatar image is actually going to take and create the will create the gravatar. And then go out to the gravatar site and create the link to create the mail. And what we're doing here is you see these data-email and data-size. Those are actually parameters that we're going to pass to that directive to tell it, here's the email address that you need to do the MD5 hash on that you sent to gravatar, and here's the size of the image that I want back. Excuse me. Okay, so now let me go over here and I'll show you the controller behind the scenes. Come on. Okay. So this is the controller, and again, I use the convention that I create. Matter of fact, let me bring up app.js real quick, which is my my application startup. And when I say application startup, it basically defines my modules and sets up my route. So we start off with, and I create, how many people use namespaces in JavaScript to basically keep yourself off the global, right? So we start off and we create a namespace called application. And then we start defining Angular modules. And the whole thing about an Angular module is that is a way to register Angular and say, okay, everything in this namespace is going to fall under this module. And oh, by the way, okay, like in this case here, rate of Stogie services, I have dependencies that my modules are dependent upon, like the constants and the MongoLab resource HTTP. And so that way, what Angular does at startup time is it takes this dependency map and it says, okay, I've got to load this guy up. It loads everything, but it waits until everything loads, and it says, okay, now I read this one in, and then read this one in, and then this one in. And it does it in orders of the dependency tree based on how your dependencies are. So what will happen in this case, before it'll even register or execute the services controller, it's going to have to load up the constants controller, and then it's going to have to wait for this Mongo Lab resource HTTP module to get loaded and get instantiated before he'll continue with the next one. And then same way down here with the filters, there's nothing there. If you see a blank like this, then there are no dependencies for that module. So it can actually get kicked up at any time. And then our directives, in this case, they're basically just dependent on the services. And our controllers should actually be dependent on the services as well. Then we actually, this is the actual app module itself. So this is going to be the core module, Stogie, and then it's dependent upon the UI, Angular UI library, the Bootstrap library. We're using the carousel and transitions. They broke everything out so that you could pick and choose and just use the things that you want. So there's a lot of dependencies here. The ng grid, and then the Mongo Lab resource, and then every one of my other modules: filters, services, directives, constants, controllers. And then we're going to do a configuration. So a module has about 6 different functions on it. They've got config, they've got run. So config happens as soon as it loads the module up. And what it does is you can set this up and it'll happen once. And then you have a .run, it'll happen after the module is completely loaded and everything. And so if you need to do something, like you need to run something in as soon as everything else is done loading, then it'll run through the run method for you. So that's a way that you can do something before the module loads. You use the config. And then if you need to run it and do something after the module loads, then you use the .run method. So in this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure the route provider. And this is actually a service provided by Angular that does all the switching of the view for you based on the URLs that are in there. So it has this nice little syntax. When I get this URL, then I want to instantiate this object or this view object. And you can provide it either a template and actually give it code, or you can give it a template URL. You can also give it a controller. So if you want to have one template and have different controllers that use that template, you can then say comma controller colon and give it the name of the controller. In my case, I'm basically, each one of my controllers are one-to-one. So my home controller and my home partial are tied together. So I just define the template in that case. So like in this case here, if we rate cigar with an ID, this is the way you actually pass in stuff. So they try to keep it very, I'll say REST-like, where you normally would have, cigar/ID. And in this case, that's kind of how I kept it here. But you can actually pass in different parameters. So if I want, the thing is if you want to pass in multiple parameters on the URL, you do slash, and then the next one, slash, and then the next one. And so what happens is that you end up with, if I wanted to say I wanted to rate something with, let's say the brand was Gurkha, and then the type was, let's say, Toro, then I would have slash brand, colon brand, slash type, colon, slash colon type. And then it would expect to see, whenever I get a URL that says, rate cigar slash a brand name slash a type, then it would then load that up, and I can then use those parameters in my controller. That's pretty much all I've got on the net, but all these different modules are, so I've got different modules that get loaded up. I just wanted to kind of show that to you so you understood why you see application controller. So in this case here, he's just using that same controller module that we defined. And then we're going to load it up, find its dependencies. In this case, he needs the scope, which is going to be his data, the location, service, which actually helps us manipulate the browser so we can actually navigate to different URLs. I have an authenticate service that actually does the login, log out. And then we have our user resource, which we can use to actually go get stuff back from MongoDB. And so we start off with, I create a new login object, which is just nothing more than username and password. And then current user, which is I'm going to use whenever the user actually gets loaded, we'll get a broadcast that says user's been updated. And it will automatically go to the authentication service or authenticate.currentUser and assign that to my current user. So I don't have to sit around and wait for it. I can just fire off the event, and when it's done, it's going to broadcast to me and say, hey, the user's been loaded, you know, and then I can actually load that up on here. Then in this case here, we're creating a new resource, and we're setting up, this is kind of the way that the Mongo Lab service works, is if you want to modify something, you create a new resource with that object, and then you can basically manipulate it and then call update on it. In this case here, I want to set the date, the last time the guy logged in or was on here. So what I'm doing is I'm reaching out to that user resource and saying, here's the current user, give me back, in this case a brewer, I just didn't type it. I've cut and paste code from several different apps. And then I want to set the date last activity, and then I call update, and then that kicks off the resource, and it goes and updates the database. So this app is this is actually a two-tier app. You've got the client side, and then you got MongoDB sitting out in the cloud. There's no server in between here. The only reason I launched Node on here is because Chrome doesn't like to load up things off the file system. It's considered as a security risk. So here's my login function here. And so when you click the login button, he's going to basically call the authenticate service and say, here's the username and here's the password. And then he's basically going to create, and then he's going to reset the login information back. So if everything works good, then it'll basically, we'll get an update, or we won't get an update. So if it fails, we'll get an error message back. And then the logout, he basically calls the logout method. The register, this is where we're actually using the location service to change the URL to a different, to actually, this will in turn, basically when we set the path on the location, it'll come down here and say, where's register? Okay, here's register. So then I need to go over here and load up user register, user/user register partial HTML. And so he'll swap out the view on the NGV form. And then we have a method called isUserLoggedIn, and all that's doing is it's basically calling the service and saying, hey, is the user logged in or not? So if we go look at our authenticate service, it should be, let's see, I think where my services are here. Probably under common services, authenticate. So this is a very simple service. Start out, and he basically needs the HTTP $ and read scope and window, but he's basically just going to use the user resource. And here's the login function. So what we're doing is we're doing a query against MongoDB with the username, and then we're using this then method on that. So what happens, the query is going to return back a promise, and so when we get data back from the server, we're then going to execute this function that's in this then, and we're going to say, okay, if my user's length is equal to 0, then hey, you gave me an invalid username or password. Or in this case, an invalid username. If I've got something, then I'll get the first user, and then I actually hash all the passwords. So I hash the password that's given to me on the login, and then compare that to the password. So we're actually doing password hashing in here too on this side. That's something that a lot of people would do on the client side, but yeah, this is an example I have. And if the two hashes don't match, then hey, you give me an invalid password. If everything's good, then we'll set the current user on the service, and then we'll broadcast the user's been updated. That'll tell everybody else in the app, hey, you could go get the customer. Now there's a way you can actually pass in the user object on the end of this as an object, and then that way you can actually, on that broadcast, you wouldn't have to make the next call to the service. You could just take the data that was passed along with it. So am I like way over everybody's heads? Anybody got questions?
Can you show us the click function?
Okay. So actually, the first click function that we looked at was this login on the controller. So this guy here, that actually gets called when we click on it, and then this one when we click on the register. And so then all he's doing is, so what happens is, because we've exposed this on the scope, on the login partial here, whenever this event happens, the click event happens on the login button, then he's gonna, me and my fat fingers, he's gonna basically call that login method off the scope right there. Is that what you were wanting to see, or?
Yeah, I was just curious if the element that was clicked is passed into the function.
It actually can be. I just don't have it. You can get the element. You actually get an event object and some other stuff. This is very basic stuff.
So you can prevent the default action.
Yeah.
Okay.
Matter of fact, it does it by default. So it won't run up the top. But you also there is an event object that is passed into you as well. Matter of fact, let me go out to the Angular site. So anybody who wants to learn Angular and has not looked at it, if you go to AngularJS.org, they have quite a bit here. They have a developer tutorial that will walk you through, and they do like a phone catalog, and you can do that side by side, and you can actually also pull down the code off of GitHub. They have some pretty extensive developer guide that to get into stuff, and their end-to-end testing stuff is probably, this is where you're going to find the most about it. And so what they do is they do a domain-specific language. It looks almost just like Jasmine, but they've added some commands to it. So if anybody's ever used Jasmine to do unit testing, you have a describe method, which is basically describes your suite. And then you have like a before each method and an after each method that'll execute before each test and then after each test. And then you have like an it command. So like it should do this, or it should do that, or it shouldn't do this. Yeah.
Kind of a high-level question here. What's the scope of AngularJS's goals? Is it just infrastructure MVC, or does it also bring in things like responsive web design type things like that?
Actually, it's really just around the MVC part of it and dealing with that. As far as responsive web design, they feel that that's actually better handled by CSS and things like Bootstrap and that. They don't try to. And one of the things about it is because of the way the dependency injection is set up, is if you don't like their error handling routine, you can define your own and replace it. Or if you don't like their HTTP backend, you can replace it by redefining $HTTP.
So it doesn't bring in any like UI widgets or anything like that?
No, matter of fact, that's where the Angular UI project comes in, and the UI Bootstrap project, and things like the ng grid and that. It's designed to really basically just be like a framework, and that's it. Now they did do some animation stuff, so give you easy transitions between things, so you can add. So like if you wanted to have your views fly in from the left or from the right, they just added that to the library with this latest release, which I think is 1.14. 1.1.4, I think it is. And they're doing some more stuff there. But they basically try to stay out of it. Same way with like localization. They do have like a pluralization service that you can define things like 1, 2, 3, however, stuff like that. But I actually ended up writing a library that does localization because it only did certain things, and if you wanted to change your languages on the fly, it didn't handle for that. So I ended up writing a library for one of our clients that does stuff. They're like, well, we need to support 3 different languages, so it was very easy to do that on the fly. But they get into things like, here's some of the API for like pause, sleep, browser navigate to a URL. You can cause it to reload. You can get the hash of the browser. They use a lot of expect for matchers. So if anybody's familiar with Jasmine, if you want to test a condition, you say expect to be true, expect to be falsy or truthy. And they've done a lot of that as well. So like here's an example. Expect the browser location href to equal value. And so you can, oh, I think we died. Can you guys still hear? Oh, okay, it's on. Oh. Somebody's playing with me, I guess. Maybe it is dying. No? Not anyway. Anyway, you can basically use equations like this or lines like that to make sure that you get to the right spot. They also have like all your input elements. You do input and whatever is in the ng model, and you can say enter if it's an input field. Check if it's a checkbox. You can select values. And then they also have repeaters. For your repeaters, you can say, okay, this guy's a repeater, and I want to get the count. How many did I get out? So if you're expecting 5 and only 4 show up, you can actually use that in the test. You can also get data columns out of there, because if you've got different pieces of data, it'll give you back the entire row of data that was bound. You can also go check options in the select box, because they actually have an ng option. So if you don't want to use an ng repeat inside your select, you can put a line on there that says, okay, I have a select and I want to use ng option, and say for I in prices, and it would basically auto-populate your options for you. So if you want to find out more about it, I highly suggest you go out to AngularJS.org. They do have a complete reference library in here. They've overridden all the input and form stuff. They also, like the aref, they have a bunch of stuff like ngbind. They do everything in a safe way. So that was the other thing that they do, is safety is concerned. So if you have HTML that you want to kind of display, and it's actually got embedded HTML, it's going to sanitize that, so you're not going to get your breaks and stuff like that. If you want unsafe HTML to be displayed, you have to use ngbind HTML unsafe. So this actually cuts down on cross-site scripting attacks and script kiddies and stuff like that. They've got classes for even and odds and when you roll, so just all sorts of things. They have a bunch of filters, and we didn't really go into filters much, but you can, let's say you have a value, you want to display it as a currency item, so you can use the currency filter, and you can actually provide a symbol if you want a symbol. And then based on the language, by default, it'll use whatever is the appropriate currency symbol for the language. You can also, they have the date filter, and you can basically format date objects dynamically on the fly quite a bit. But it's basically, you take whatever your data expression is, and they use pipes to assign filters, basically. And you'll see people who are actually doing client-side paging, or they want to page through a long thing, and you'll see that they'll have an array, they'll do an ng repeat, and they'll have your 4x in whatever your set is. Then they'll have a pipe, and they'll have a start from directive or a start from filter, and then another pipe will say limit it to 5 or 10. And so what they'll do is they'll get a paging, just the next 10 items, and then when you click next, it'll show the next 10 items. Let's go back to here real quick. And we just got a couple other things real quick. So there are some tools and resources. One of the things that if you're gonna use AngularJS, or you're gonna start writing, you want to use Batarang. And this actually is a plugin for Chrome. And let me bring it up here, and I can show it to you on my side here. So it's let's get into my developer tools. And the first thing is, if we go over here and we let me inspect this element here. Is if you close down the styles, you'll see this AngularJS properties, and so it automatically gives you your basically your scope representation for the scope wherever that object is. So if I find another one over here, so that's the scope for this guy here. If we go up a little bit higher in the menu partial, and I think I click here, you'll see the scope changes, and that's basically the object. So to say, okay, here's my current user, I can see all the data there, and then these are the methods that are actually part of the scope. That's the first thing. The other thing is if we turn Batarang on, you can see dynamically at runtime, you can see the different scopes or the models. So like this is the models for scope 8. There's nothing really there. Let's go down a little bit farther and let's see here. So here's like here's the scopes for my slide rotator. It also that's the models. You can also look at performance, and you can see who's eating up your CPU, your draw utilization.
But it's only for Chrome.
It's only for Chrome, yes. That's because the guys that developed Angular work for Google, and so guess what? They had Chrome available to them. But it'd be nice if they had it available for for Firefox and all that. But and then this is all the dependencies. If you guys, I said this was a simple app, but if you look at all the different things that are out there, that's the UI library that's brought in, and mass directives, reset directives, exception handlers, and everything. And this kind of shows you where all your dependencies are. To me, it's not much abuse. The other thing you can do is you can say, I want to show bindings and show scopes, and you'll see that now you can see all your different scopes based on they're highlighted out with colors, and then you'll see all your bindings are in blue, so you can see what actually was bound versus what wasn't. So that's a tool that is really good for helping you debug things. The other thing is knowing how to debug JavaScript in whatever browser you use, because you will be in there. Sometimes you'll have side effects or whatever. Let's go back over here to this. Another good tool, and actually if you just go into the extensions, or you go to the Chrome web store and just type in Batarang, you'll find the download for it. The other one is Karma, and this is the test runner I was talking about a little bit earlier. They can do 1,600 tests in 3 seconds. And it actually does run fast, and you can actually use Phantom.js. You can also set it up to run simultaneous tests. So like if you're doing end-to-end test runs and you want to test on Chrome and Firefox and IE and Safari and Opera, you can actually say, here's a list of all the browsers that I'm going to use, and it will basically instantiate a session on each and then start to run the test on every browser one by one. So it's a very easy to use tool. You can install it via npm by calling install-g karma, and it's very simple to use. Very good. That supports it. It was actually made by one of the test runners. If you want to see things that people have built using Angular, if you go to builtwithangularjs.org, I don't know how many people have a PS3, but if the YouTube app on PS3 actually was built with Angular. That was their big claim to fame. If you use DoubleClick, I think it is Google's ad services in that, your paid-for subscriber, that was all redone recently with Angular. Here's some other ones. If you want to get started, AKIT.io is probably one of the best places you can go to get tutorials. John Lundquist, who is a member of the WebStorm team, I think he's got, last time I counted, 56 different tutorials on Angular. They're all about 5 to 10 minutes, and they just do one little thing. But it's a really good one. There is the AngularJS tutorial that's on the website that does the phone catalog. You've also, their Pluralsight actually just came out last week with I think it's about a 6-hour course on AngularJS. So if you go to the JavaScript section on Pluralsight, there's AngularJS fundamentals. We do have a meetup group that meets the 3rd Thursday of every month. If you go out to meetup and look up for DFW AngularJS. The one thing I don't have on here is there is a Google group. So if you go to groups.google.com and search for AngularJS, and it is very, very active, as well as the Stack Overflow. If you do brackets AngularJS, you can find all the latest, hottest items. tools, Karma and Batarang, and books are just starting to come out. These are the first two completed books. AngularJS, which is actually written by Brad Green, which is the project manager on the AngularJS team. It's a very good introductory book. I will warn you that there are some errors in it, so go hit the errata and pull down the code samples. There's some of the stuff doesn't work if you go straight to the book. Recipes with AngularJS is written by a gentleman in Germany, and he's self-published out on LeanPub. This is basically the AngularJS cookbook. If you want to know how to create a directive that talks to other directives, he's got a recipe in there for you. And it's a very good, hey, I need a quick solution or I need a good example. There's 3 other books coming out that I know of. There's Pack Publishing's got one that you can get right now in a raw edition. I think it's called AngularJS Web, or Building AngularJS Web Applications, which is actually written by another member, another contributor to AngularJS, as well as a contributor to the Angular UI team. It's a very good deep dive into the core of Angular. He spends at least 2 chapters on things like directives and forms and things like that. So you'll walk away from that with a really good understanding. And the other one is AngularJS in Practice, which is written by Brian Ford, who was an intern last year that wrote Batarang, and he's coming back to the AngularJS team this year after he graduated. So at least the people writing the books are actually, most of them are on the core team or contributors. And that's pretty much it. And I always throw stuff out there all the time on AngularNet. You can either go to my website, coding.smackdown.tv. I've got a lot of posts out there on Angular, stuff that stripped me up over the last 6 months. Or you can find me on Twitter as Otaku Brewing, or you can find me on Google plus Jim Lavin. Any questions? Yes?
How would you compare Angular with something like Ember, and why did you choose Angular?
Well, so I came from a Knockout.js background, and I picked Knockout.js mainly over Backbone and Ember because it seemed a little bit simpler, and it was also kind of pushed by Microsoft, and we were at Microsoft shop. But if you look at what we were going to have to do with Knockout to get the same functionality, not only would I have to use Knockout, but I would have had to pull in SAMI and require.js and all these other things to get dependency injection, to get to actually handle my the routing and stuff. And Angular just kind of handled that. Plus, the complexity level of Angular is much lower than it was in Knockout and some of these other libraries. So instead of having to learn, let's say, 4 to 5 different libraries in order to get the same functionality, you only have to deal with one. And that's why I feel it's a lot simpler. And we have turnover in our company, so it was like, I don't want to have to sit there and spend 3 months getting somebody ramped up on it. It's simple enough that I can take a web designer who's new, a junior web designer, that has some JavaScript background, and say, okay, if you want to click, you use ng-click, and then here's how you do a click function type of thing. The more advanced stuff is left to myself and the other senior developer. But I mean, the majority of everything else is done by our design team. And we just worry about back-end code and that.
So you think it's more approachable?
I think it's much more approachable, yes. Anything else? Yes?
Can you suggest what are the best tools to debug JavaScript?
Well, the best tool that I will say is either Firebug for Firefox, or you're going to use the Chrome developer tools, or you're going to use the developer tools on Safari or or on IE. I mean, because there's nothing like walking through the code. So if you can set a breakpoint and you can walk line by line in the code, that's all you really need. Now, the other thing to do to kind of do static analysis is you can look at JSLint or JSHint. So like if you've got Visual Studio, it'll automatically do it for you if you download the Web Essentials. WebStorm, matter of fact, let me switch over here to WebStorm. It actually does it for you automatically as well. You can, you'll see stuff like this. He's saying I've got an unresolved function or method browser because he doesn't know where it's at. But it automatically syntaxes, it'll highlight stuff and it'll show you your errors. So things like this will help you better as you're writing it, but the best thing to do with JavaScript is going to be the tools that are in the browser. Visual Studio, if you're going to use IE, I would say IE in conjunction with Visual Studio, especially if you're developing on that platform, because you can do all your debugging in Visual Studio. It'll allow you to set breakpoints in the browser on IE. But today we normally we either use Firefox or Firebug with Firefox, or we're using the Chrome developer tools. Now, if you're interested in and they just released a whole bunch of upgrades for Chrome developer tools, things like you can actually save to disk and that, so you can actually make a change in the debugger, or in the debug window, and actually save it back to disk and stuff like that. So, and there's actually, I'm trying to think, I think Code Academy or maybe Code School, they've actually got a course on Chrome developer tools that's free. If you go out on Google Plus and search for, I think, Chrome developer tools class, or they've got something you can actually watch for free, and it's about 5-6 hours on using things, the whole Chrome developer tools. Anybody else? Yes?
If I wanted to do responsive UI and take advantage of AngularJS and needed some drag and drop kind of widgets, what kind of combination am I looking at? Angular UI Bootstrap and
well, there's actually an Angular directive called drag and drop. Brian Ford did. It gives you full drag and drop capability between two windows. So you could use that, and then you could use Bootstrap or any responsive thing. Matter of fact, I wish my screen was a little bit wider so I could actually show you this, but I also have this little plug-in here, and I can actually go in and see if I can change this. I don't think I get any lower down. I was going to kind of show you, but let me close this window here and get this guy, and I'll shrink it down a little bit. I mean, this guy, this will continue to collapse. I'm using UI, and he'll continue to collapse and expand. But if you notice, my stuff falls below it here automatically. And then if I go back over here and we'll max this out, you'll see it drops back out to 3 based on that. That's all being done by Bootstrap. I'm not doing anything special in Angular at all. And all I'm using is like row fluid, container fluid is basically all I'm using throughout the code.
And is this the original Bootstrap or a version of Bootstrap that's specifically built on Angular?
Actually, this is the original Bootstrap. This is actually, I think, 2.0. Matter of fact, go back over here and bring up my project. If you look in my lib, let's see what version we have here. Actually, component.js. This is 2.11. So, but this is the actual. This is actual Bootstrap responsive CSS and Min. So this is the straight off the Bootstrap site. You don't need. And again, Angular will complement any CSS or HTML you have as markup. So you don't have to worry about I can only use this package or anything with it. You can use anything you want with it.
But don't you want to minimize the number of different things you want to eliminate jQuery out of the picture? Or
well, you can if you don't want to use jQuery. That's where the UI Bootstrap project comes in. They've actually taken all the Bootstrap jQuery stuff and they've rewritten it with Angular. Okay. And Angular actually has a jQuery Lite functionality in it that basically is all the jQuery functionality that Angular needs. But if you're used to using a lot of that, or you have other plugins, that you may have to include it, and they'll work well together. But yeah, you can get rid of jQuery completely if you don't want to use it. And in the case of the UI of using Bootstrap, you just use the UI Bootstrap library, and just include those modules that you want to use. So like if you want to use the accordion piece, or you want to use the mobile dialog, then all you got to do is include those minified files.
Thank you.
You have a question?
Yes. What kind of problem you were experiencing when you do SEO?
Okay, so this is very SEO unfriendly.
I know, I see that. That's why I asked you what.
But okay, so what people are doing is they're using tools like Phantom.js, and they're actually using Phantom.js to actually create the pages and actually putting those out there and then telling Google or whoever where to go find those pages. So they're directing Google, here's where all our SEO pages are, but the application is totally dynamic. So if you need it,
So that's a good thing. You can
Yeah.
manipulate Google.
yeah. Well, and actually I think Google already had that in mind because there was a lot of people complaining that with totally dynamic websites, they're not going to go run down everything, right? And the fact is that there are, in my application and actually in our online ordering application, there's not a hard-coded URL anywhere. Everything is a click event. So you're never, a web crawler is never going to get past the first page. They're going to basically have to brute force it like they would if they're trying to do some type of attack on the site. But there are ways to do it. And if you go to the AngularJS Google group and just look up SEO optimization, there's several different discussions about that. Anybody else? Yes?
Did you say you had a pizza site?
Yeah, I have a pizza site.
Demo that?
Yeah, well, the one that we're actually, let's see, I'll have to, let me bring up my, I'm trying to think if, I don't think Burritos is up. I have a burrito site. Let's see if they, go to burritos.ordertalk.net. Oh, that's the manager site. Let's go to preview. So this site that's coming up now, this is actually all done with AngularJS. And again, my screen's a little bit smaller, so we're getting drop downs for things from my account and stuff like that. But let me do one thing here. I probably need to clear out my stuff because this is a new database. So go to tools. I'm going to delete out all my cookies. Shouldn't have any cookies going on. We'll start from scratch. So we start out with select your location, Kentucky, Ohio, and then we'll get our available pickup locations. And so the map is brought in from Google. Now this is going to pick the location, and then it's automatically going to bring us into the menu. So everything you're seeing here is dynamically being generated. We're in the background pulling down their entire menu for you. And this is actually on the desktop server sitting at our office, so it's not very fast. But they have menu sections up here, so you've got like your quesadillas, your snack wraps, salads. So every time I'm clicking, it's actually setting up a different section and redrawing this section here, which has got all the menu items on it. So if we want to do a classic burrito, we just went out and grabbed the menu item, brought it back, and then we're on our add item page. So we can pick our size. I think I'll do a bowl, and then I can pick my protein. I don't know if you noticed, everything changed on me when I switched from bowl to regular. You notice that? Flour tortilla, WinRA, stuff like that. So we actually have code in there that says, if this, based on this guy, if this option something, hide this guy, show him up. And we can pick our protein. So like if we get, I think it's grilled chicken. Let's try the organic tofu now. I think it's the rice. Hold on. Let's try this. If I go no cilantro rice, it'll pop up when I get substitute rice. So we'll put brown rice in there, and we'll add some extra meat, and then we'll add guacamole. And I can put my name on it, or I can add that. But hey, I might want some other ingredients. So we've got hot ingredients we can add in here. I can add caramelized onions, or I can do easy broccoli. They've got cold ingredients too. If I actually want lettuce on my burrito, I can add that. Here we go. And once I'm done, if I click add to order, they'll go back. It's adding that. So it went back to the server and added it. And if you see over here, you can see here. So I've got one item in my cart, the classic, and here's everything that we added. We added extra meat. We added guacamole. And the neat thing that's cool is watch the price. If I change this to 2, and and tab out, he'll automatically go update and do everything. If I decide I don't want zero, I just want zero of these guys, he'll get rid of it for me automatically on the fly. And that's all being done on the client side. And then we do the whole back end. So, any questions? Any other questions? I can show you localization in process. I'll show you Peter Piper. Peter Piper Pizza is one of our clients as well. And they wanted to do, they needed English and Spanish on the fly. So right now we're in English. Like Spanish would go directly to Spanish. Like to English. So if we start an order and we go ahead and I'll select the location and we'll get into the order, watch how the menu will change on the fly for us here. If I just flip back and forth, everything goes to Spanish. And the way we're doing that, if I let's do a inspect element here. So what we have is, and this is actually part of one of the projects. If you go to GitHub and go to Lavin JJ and look for AngularJS localization, we have these little data I18N, and we're actually passing in like tokenized names here. If you see down there, it says data-I18N equals menu section 2 name. So what that does is that goes and hits the service on the back end and says, give me the localized string for that, and then we actually replace the text content of the element. And we do that on the fly. You know. And we're actually at this point, whenever we pick this, we're actually going back to the server. When I go click on English, we went to the server, we went and got the dictionary with all the new localized resources, and we just re-updated the page. So that's how nice it is and how quick it is. Any other questions? Yes.
What backend system are you using?
This is actually built on ASP.NET, MVC4, and 4.5. So what we're doing is we're using the web API on the back end. You can use anything you want. It's just that that's where all our code and all our intellectual property lies, so we built on top of that.
Does the art side on GitHub as well?
Yes, it is. If you look for Ratastogi, and then there's, let's see, oh, here, matter of fact, let me go out to GitHub. I've got several different projects that are all Angular related here. So we've got the localization service, which you'll basically, and all these actually have example apps with them so that you can see how to use it. But the localization service, the Gravatar directive that I was showing earlier, that's here. We've got an example of using pub/sub to do messaging between controllers and services and all that. Code Explode is actually a book that I've been working on, actually around Angular, but I haven't really got very far on it. Work takes precedence. And some of these other ones go with, you'll see on my blog, they refer out here. Ratastogi is one, and then I think Code Explode right now doesn't have anything in it, but they all are example projects. And I usually try to do that, is try to put working code up for you, or there'll be a JS fiddle in a blog. So you're more than welcome to pull it down, change it, make it better. Give me a pull request if you find a better way to do it. And I've got several pull requests. I haven't checked lately. Do I have any today? No. I have no issues, and that's a good thing. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you.